就是刘梦平写了个大。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到今天的思想先驱报节目现场啊。在节目开始之前，何明先生还在焦急的跟这个自己的这个同事和朋友通话啊。我们的这个声音不知道有没有进去了，如果进去的话啊，向各位网友表示道歉。这个何斌先生啊，每天啊是一场接着一场的上节目啊，但是呢，何斌先生啊经常跟我们抱怨啊，天天给你当这个思想先驱报的陪榜，能不能换一个人？那如果大家呢各位网友中有希望做李琦的思想先驱报的联合主持啊，那么把这个何斌先生替下去，那我当然是非常兴奋的啊。那么如果呢，
我更高兴。
当然咱们也是认真的说，也是开玩笑的说啊，这个思想先驱报啊做到现在，那么其实呢，大家也都很明白，我们希望带来一些新鲜的、不同的视角，不仅仅是谈论中国问题，不仅仅谈论政治问题，有关于经济的、科技的、文化的，近期看过的电影、电视和最近的好书，所有这一些话题呀，只要有独特的见解和角度，能够为我们的观众朋友们带来一些新鲜、不同的视角和观念，我们都希望在思想先驱报中能够有所介绍。那如果您有一技所长啊，如果您所学的专业可能是您特别希望与我们的观众朋友们分享的，那么赶快把何明先生换下去，这样呢，他可以踏踏实实的吃个饭啊，跟自己的老朋友叙叙旧啊，同时呢跟网友聊一聊天啊。那么我呢身边也可以换一个更好的联合主持人，希望各位网友踊跃自荐，或者是推荐他人。这个何明先生这把椅子坐的已经是十分的不耐烦，每天在这儿是如坐针毡。我在这边嘚啵说，何明先生那边玩手机呀，打一打游戏呀，炒一炒股票
不玩游戏，完全造谣，我也不炒股票。
然后这个点赞一些美女美图各种各样的事情关于和平先生的这一些私下的细节，改天等他换掉他这一位联合主持人后，再与各位进行详细的揭露。今天话归正传，回到中国本身的经济问题。有关于中国的经济问题近期可以说是铺天盖地的报道来自国际媒体的，来自中国内部的一些专业人士的分析。其实呢，不同的分析角度总能给我们不一样的思考。但是今天要向大家特别介绍的是来自彭博社的一篇长篇报道。这一篇报道的名字非常的有趣，叫做《冷处理：习近平为何放任中国经济徘徊不前》。为什么叫冷处理呢？与习近平的冷处理形成对比的就是美国以及其他的欧洲国家在面对经济疫情压力下行之时所采取的热处理的办法。即使现在中国甚至可能面临通缩的风险，中国也不采取大规模的刺激措施，这个背后的原因到底是什么？彭博社的这一篇文章刚开始就告诉我们，这个过去中国经济发展的奇迹可以说是引领了中国一代人的生活的质量的迅速的提高。但是习近平现在似乎正在试图改写中国经济发展的游戏规则，但是改写规则能不能够成功，却面临严峻的考验。文章开始就向我们介绍了一整组数据，中国18万亿美元的经济现在出现了减速，消费者情绪比较低落，出口也十分的艰难，物价甚至出现了下跌的风险。中国有1/5以上的年轻人找不到工作，其中很多困境并不是这一次疫情开始之后才产生的，也不完全是由疫情期间的封锁造成的。在习近平任期的前几年，那么他就决心摆脱之前的胡温时代以债务为动力的经济增长模式，即使是导致了房地产危机愈演愈烈，但是缓解危机的措施却始终不拿出来。结果这样的一个对待经济的手法促使摩根大通、巴克利银行、摩根士丹利等机构一致下调了对于中国经济增长的预测。现在市场的普遍预期已经低于政府在年初设定的5%的目标。外国投资者对于中国市场的情绪也出现了转冷，甚至有一些投资人正在撤出资金。今天早上我看到一篇非常有趣的文章某一位机构一位明星分析师说，这个外资就是搅屎棍说外资没有什么节操，也没有什么水准。当然了，有人说你这个搅屎棍，那搅的是什么？你是在说中国股市是什么给人感觉呢有这么一点大不敬的意思。外国投资者正在撤出，这个时候是跟风而行还是明智之举？大家外界评价显然也不一致。而中国央行现在也面临着严峻的挑战， 正在加大力度阻止人民币喋喋不休。美国财政部长耶伦被认为呢是一位非常专业的经济人士，也表示中国现在已经成为了美国的一个风险因素，讲到的是中国对于整个国际市场可能产生的影响。而美国的总统拜登甚至在最近的一次竞选集会活动中直接说中国经济是一颗定时炸弹，也引起了北京方面很大的愤怒。那么美国和中国在处理本国所面临的经济挑战时采取的方式各自有哪一些特点呢？我们先来看美国采取的方式。来自彭博社的报道把这一种方式归结成为叫做热经济，用数万亿美元来刺激家庭消费和基础设施建设，可以说是一脚油门踩到底，希望因为疫情陷入困顿的美国经济可以迅速的复苏。而习近平呢，采取的是冷处理的办法。根据来自彭博社的分析，他希望最终能够打破中国此前靠投机性房地产建设、不透明的地方借贷资助的低回报项目来推动经济增长找出的一系列的痼疾问题。如果说中国是一颗定时炸弹，那么习近平似乎也是笃定了目标，拆除这一颗炸弹，不引爆这一颗炸弹。来自彭博社的报道分析这世界两大经济体之间有关于经济管理理念的冲突，其实现在成为了改变投资流向的重要因素。那么如果习近平拆弹不善，这可能会导致中国超越美国的日期继续往后延后，甚至有一些经济学家认为这样的时刻可能永远也不会到来了。习近平不仅仅是他一个人，还有他所领导的一个被认为对于他政治上忠诚的团队。他们的风险在于什么呢？拆弹没有拆好，这颗蛋还是破了。还有一种就是避免过度刺激，导致大家对于经济发展的信心一下子削弱，情绪转于悲观，而对于中国经济发展的悲观预言成了自我实现的诺言。有一位经济学者叫做霍夫曼他现在好像在新加坡的一所大学教经济学，他同时是世界银行前中国部的主任。他讲到中国的衰退是什么呢？叫做预期衰退。什么叫做预期衰退？一旦整个经济体的所有的参与者都认为未来的经济增长会出现放缓，那么可能未来的经济增长就真的会放缓，所谓自我实现的预言。如果摩根大通对于中国经济增长放缓的趋势数字是正确的，那么中国将面临的情势是连续3年 GDP 的增长率低于 5%。 根据来自彭博社的统计，这是1976年以后就没有出现的情况。甚至有经济学家预言，这样的一种经济放缓的态势是不是会以永久性的停滞，或者是所谓的日本化而告终。也有一些经济学家现在看到中国最新的消费价格指数，认为中国已经出现了通货紧缩的警告信号。物价下跌既是需求疲软的表现，也有可能会拖累未来的经济增长。首先是家庭推迟购买，那么家庭不买东西了，企业的利润也就会下降，企业的利润下降了，企业实际的借贷成本也就会进一步的上升，导致投资活动的进一步放缓。有这样的一个词叫做动物精神。什么叫动物精神呢？简而言之就是企业家的某一种冒险精神。现在企业家的动物精神似乎有所丧失之前中国对于一些行业的打压，特别是对于互联网行业的打压，让很多现在在中国的企业家过去认为中国是挣钱的福地，现在也是转而寻求海外的机会。再加上房地产行业的急剧下滑与美国裂痕的加深，导致现在对于中国经济增长的预期下调已经成为既定的事实。而彭博社的首席经济学家汤姆·奥利克甚至预计，到2030年，中国的年增长率可能会放缓至3.5个百分点左右。那我们也知道中国在过去的几年里受到经济危机或者是萧条的威胁，其实并不是第一次。比如2015年著名的股灾，当时也是引发了混乱的人民币贬值，国内股市的全部崩盘。耶伦女士当时还是美联储的主席，那么当时中国股市出现的情况，就让作为美联储主席的耶伦女士感到十分的不安。那么直接是取消了原定的加息活动。 现在是不是到了这一步呢？对于美联储加息减息的预期，是不是再有可能受到中国市场的影响呢？暂停加息变成降息的速度，是不是会比市场预期更快呢？简而言之，由于中国现在已经是一个庞然大物的经济体，它的经济状况所出现的外溢效应，也远远不能够控制在中国本国的边境之内。有关于彭博社关于中国经济冷处理、美国经济热处理这种哲学和迷人，你怎么看？
我觉得这几乎是一种正常的现象嘛。我们渐渐知道，过去30-40年，中国已经持续的这么高速的经济增长。任何一个经济体，任何一个国家在发展过程中间，无论是计划经济还是市场经济，基本上没有办法呢按照原来的预期发展的那么美好，那么均衡。某个阶段的产业的失控，某个产业的爆破，或者是某个产业这种不像大家预期的这么发展在现在这种经济的加速度的发展之下，这本身就是应该需要这个条件。而这个条件的杠杆呢，按照我们原来的很多的对市场经济的理解或者是想象，应该通过市场经济来调节。在某些方面可能还是的，或者这种体现出来的呢，还是市场的这种巨大的这个自由调节能力。但是对于一个国家来讲，它有没有承受能力来让市场去自由调整，这就需要了有非常坚实的这种法治大家比较信任的法治，大家对前途有某一些信心，或者说呢整个国际环境呢比较好，或者说呢你本身的产业呢只是一时的这个现象。所以如果在这种情况之下，你要去放心的去冷处理，那当然是没有问题。但是中国的情况很显然要比这个要复杂很多，缺乏一个法治的环境政治意识形态的过分的宣扬那么资金过于的集结在某一些领域又找不到新的这种出口。那么这又是加上所谓的大家热门词叫地缘政治或者是中美关系那么全球的经济的影响，很多的不利因素堆积在一起，再加上习近平的强势的集权领导那么这样的话呢，它会不会这种形成一个巨大的洪流？就是刚才李杰博士介绍的世界银行的前中国局局长讲的是个自我实现的预言。我说如果假如是能够实现这个自我实现的预言，中国真的是衰退了比日本还要糟糕或者甚至呢是一个更大的一个南美的陷阱这是呢某一些急迫的政治变革的朋友他的某一些潜在的一种心理，或者说呢对中国的这些年的发展自己找不到理由来去理解或者是支持中国这种发展的这种状况的人，或者还有其他的跟中国竞争的人，他们当然心里面呢期待到中国呢走向这样一种状况。而站在习近平的角度来讲现在我不知道他有没有一份奉天日报，我看也不需要，因为中国的媒体几乎都是奉天日报都是跟现实的世界有脱离非常之大，甚至可以说是扭曲对这个世界的认知，更扭曲中国的情况。在媒体和信息的角度来讲，中国这个不会比文化大革命好到哪里去甚至可以说呢比今天的俄罗斯的情况还要糟糕。那么习近平是在什么情况之下形成他的决策？他的决策是完全被马屁精包围了，被扭曲的信息包围了，还是过度的这个自信？还是说呢他认为就像彭博同学讲的，其实他知道这些问题的存在是几乎必须经过的一个痛苦。就像朱镕基的时代，大家记得吗？那个时候的游行抗议示威比现在要真实的很多。为什么？很多的下岗工人一旦丢了铁饭碗，他就没有了人生，因为他一辈子就是端着这个铁饭碗，认为呢自己的一辈子就这样了结果突然之间你把我的饭碗端掉了而且呢把工程卖给别的人。那个时候的下岗工人的这种悲惨的情况，到今天还在延伸在这个东北东北是非常非常严重的。所以我们现在在法拉盛在纽约，在很多的地方开始见到了从最开始的农民 福建广东这些地方的农民逃亡或者是偷渡过来，后来慢慢变成了东北人，用各种各样的方式到了这个美国来我跟他们也交流过很多我也在东北有很多的这个朋友，东北人也有他特殊的个性，很有趣的一点。但是东北当大家认为东北要完蛋了，对吧？再也没有希望了。这是我听到很多离开东北人的，他们真的是一等非常真实的声音，所以他们在共产党的厌恶，对习近平的怨恨，那是非常非常之多的，对前途的绝望但是事实上大家看一看今年的 GDP 的增长，从长春到哈尔滨，从大连到沈阳它的 GDP 的增长甚至比南方的城市还要好。也许你可以说它的底子很薄所谓的上升比较快，但是你就不注意到中国的60之后的中国的经济发展即使在不经意之间这么追起来的。92年并没有带来一个资金立即的引入，92年并没有重新引起大家的希望，是92年、93年、94年、95年、96年、97年、98年这样慢慢发展，最终到了21世纪，在猛然发现中国成为了世界上最重要的一个经济体。所以很多的看法这个需要更多的数据，很多的看法需要更开阔的心，很多的看法你要真要根据的实际的情况。今天中国是不是所有的产业都摧毁了？房地产不行了，房地产的不行对整体的经济是彻底的拖垮，还是一些连带的一些反应，比如说上下游整个系统的资金都受到一些产业受到影响？还是说呢，中国也在跟美国一样的，跟世界上很多的国家一样的，努力想改变自己的产业的结构，努力想改变自己的这个生产形态？他说我认为是后者中国和全世界很多的国家一样的，也在挣扎着走出疫情之后的这样一个带来的负面作用，走出一个全球的新技术浪潮所带来的这样一个背景，走向迎合这个浪潮，走向一个全球化的一种冲击等等每一个国家其实都在努力往上走只是走的程度呢不太一样，其实大致的方向不一样。中国比较令人厌恶的是就是它的意识形态的对大家的污染，媒体的控制，对大家认知的一种扭曲。但是就算是这样，中国的经济的变革根本没有停止步伐。我今天早上在刷牙的时候，我突然就想起来70年代当年所谓的粉色四人帮之后，我们看到了最激动人心的一篇文章，是大家不太喜欢的一个文人写的，叫郭美如他写的文章的标题我现在都记得，叫《科学的春天》。也就是说，中国不管有什么意识形态的封锁，在80年代、70年代末期开始，对科学的尊重，对数理化的尊重，成为这个国家的真正的一个驱动力而这一点到现在为止也没有改变。有政治的污染，有外部环境的影响，但是中国的经济在我看起来比较大的几率走出这个危机。虽然现在是暴风雨很厉害，但是这是一时的现象，甚至这个现象可能是必要的痛苦。
好，谢谢何明先生那么来自彭博社的这一篇文章呢，其实大致的分析思路与刚才何明先生分析的相同。那基本上的一个思路就是什么呢？我们要了解中国政府为什么没有采取更多的措施来对经济进行热助力这样的问题。最根本的一点就是，我们先要从中国政府的角度来评估中国经济的前景，以及习近平到底要实现什么样的目标，他认为实现目标的看法。简而言之，就是不能以西方的视角来看中国怎样处理自己的问题，
也不能以老百姓的情绪
来看这个到底怎样处理一个问题那么习近平对于中国经济的发展的目标是什么呢？来自彭博社的报道告诉我们，其实习近平自己也说了，本世纪中叶把中国建设成为综合国力和国际影响力领先的世界国。当然这个话说的非常的没有意思，具体而言叫做高质量发展。所谓的高质量发展对应的就是低质量的发展。彭博社这一篇文章还提醒我们， 虽然我们看到中国经济现在有各种各样的问题，但是同样不可忽视的是，中国有一些领域正在蓬勃发展，比如电动汽车、太阳能、风能，还有电池等等等等。在这一些领域，不管是投资还是出口，正在以2位数的速度持续高速增长，而这一些正是习近平所看重的高科技绿色增长。即使在某一些领域实施了更加紧缩的政策，其实中国国家在投入资源促进这一种形式的增长方面，并没有体现出弱化的迹象。现在发行债券为高铁和可再生能源基础设施提供资金，规模在世界上任何一个地方都是没有办法可比的。通过为电动汽车的购买者减税，为消费者需求提供支持的速度也并没有停下来。因此我们说中国不刺激经济，不刺激经济，其实这个话既对也不对。对于一些习近平真正重视的产业，所谓高科技、绿色能源产业，其实现在不仅仅是对于投资的这个补贴对于消费的补贴一样，脚步根本就没有停下来。这一点呢，是我们需要知道的。当你看到中国政府不刺激经济的时候，往往只是看到了事情的一面，也许它不刺激的正是它不希望发展的这一些经济的领域。另外有关于消费需求不振这一点，来自彭博社的文章呢也讲到了另外一方面的情况，就是旅游和餐饮服务业的消费其实与去年年底相比还是出现了比较强劲的反弹。而且呢，这个反弹不仅仅是集中在中国国内的品牌，比如星巴克一家美国咖啡企业，上一季度在中国的销售额同比增长了多少呢？增长了46%。现在国内航班还远远没有恢复，但是也比疫情封锁之前高出了大概15%。这个游客如果大家到中国的一些旅游服务网站上去看，他们经常抱怨的是酒店因为需求飙升而不断的涨价而并不是这一些这个就说没有这样的消费需求。而同时呢，现在这样的一个需求的反弹，其实对于带活现在的就业市场也有帮助，这对于缓解领导层对于出现大规模失业的担忧也是有一定影响的。但是问题是什么呢？所有这一些可能远远不够，因为房地产对于整个中国经济而言实在太过重要。即使是新能源汽车这样的新兴产业，现在看起来被世界瞩目，世界认为中国发展得很好，但是新增长的引擎带动整个经济还是需要相当长的一段时间的。中国毕竟是一个庞大而复杂的经济体，整个房地产行业的垮掉给整个的经济仍然是地震一般的拖累。这呢，通过几个少数经济中光明的亮点，不能够掩盖整个中国经济所面临的基本的问题。但是类似的思路我们继续往下推延，所谓的新经济也就是绿色制造业微芯片高科技领域这样的一个笼统的称呼，在上半年的同比增长是多少呢？比这个 GDP 的比重高非常之多，已经占到17%，而 GDP 上半年同比增长只有6.5%。而房地产行业在上半年的增长是多少呢？非但没有增长，还出现了下滑了将近8%。加上其他的房地产上下游的相关产业，整个房地产产业占到 GDP 的20%。也就是我们看到虽然房地产这一边是一缓，新经济这一边是一增一快，但是毕竟房地产的体量大，因此我们算一个加权平均数，对于整个经济仍然是负面的拖累因素比较低。当然了，我们也说中国政府现在对于经济采取冷处理，特别是对于房地产行业和债务问题，也不是说什么都不做那比如说之前的这个3条红线，现在就有所放松了。对于这个贷款需要达到的杠杆率基准，现在呢也是有所减缓。恒大出现了违约，其他的建筑商也出现了债务违约潮。现在那么中央的一些经济官员也到这些企业来进行有关的座谈，帮助他们处理困难。那么之前的一些优质的开发商，比如碧桂园，也出现偿还债券能力存在重大不确定性这样的风险，这也是中国政府必须要解决的问题。而根本的仍然是整个房地产销售的下降。如果来自彭博社的报道正确的话，现在2023年截止目前的这样的一个房地产的销售额，比2020年的同期峰值水平已经下降了50%。不仅仅是房地产公司本身，建筑、钢铁、水泥、玻璃全部都受到了影响。 那么这样的一个房屋价值的下降啊，很大的这样的一个降幅，对于家庭的财富也造成了严重的侵蚀。一般啊认为，整个房地产占到了中国家庭财富比例的70%到80%，占到了银行抵押价值的40%，毕竟仍然是一个重大的风险所在。企业如果再继续降低利润预期，缩减投资，缩减招聘计划，可能啊对于整个经济的拖累效应就越来越大了。现在呀，上海等一些城市也已经发出了警告，表示有一些非正式行业、零工经济，比如网约车、私家车上街这样的一些职业呀，已经出现了供过于求。这无疑是劳动力需求疲软的一个信号。我们也知道，在美国你再开一辆这样的，比如说 Uber 或者是 Lyft 那么如果呢Uber 和 Lyft 的司机出现了供过于求，往往是因为某一些行业出现了大裁员等等等等。之前我们在报纸上也看过这样的新闻本来是在亚马逊工作的美国的科技白领，结果呢遭遇这样的一个失业裁员潮，没有办法，只能是一边开 Uber 接送客，晚上就去酒吧打一点零工，让人觉得这一些天之骄子，美国最聪明的年轻人，因为整个科技行业的调整，陷入这样的职业的不确定性，让人也觉得十分的痛心。当然了，中国政府内部也有不同的声音，对于现在中央似乎采取的冷处理的思路也有不同的建议。比如央行的顾问蔡方最近呢就曾经在公开场合呼吁要直接刺激消费，认为由中央政府如果借贷几万亿人民币直接投资刺激消费，可以对于经济情绪的改善起到根本的作用。但是现在其实情况也已经比较明了了，中国政府基本是不会采取大撒币、大发钱来刺激消费这样的措施。此前我们在节目中为大家介绍瑞银的中国首席王涛有关于中国经济的分析，他就讲到了一点，说对于中国领导人而言支持消费的最佳途径是支持就业，支持就业的最佳途径是通过减税来支持企业。简而言之，支持企业、支持商业部门比直接发钱到消费者手中来得更加的有效。这是中国经济管理思路与美国非常不同的一点。另外习近平过去也曾经在多个场合警告，不能陷入福利主义的陷阱。对于中国这样一个有14亿人口又极其不平等的国家而言，家庭到底应该获得整个 GDP 收入占比的多少？这不仅仅是一个经济问题，其实也是一个政治问题，涉及到对于普通中国民众的赋权问题。那么昨天呢，我还采访到了来自康奈尔大学的一位经济以及研究劳工问题的教授，他就特别讲到了这一点，就是为什么中国要向家庭消费倾斜，这个过程可能不像西方的一些经济学者想的这么简单。那么中国始终认为生产力是第一要务，另外呢，如果把太多的财富移到了普通的民间，可能会导致政府的财力单薄，政府对于经济的管理和对政治的把控能力都会有所下降。习近平近期还不断的警告手下的官员和官僚，不能为了经济增长而牺牲国家安全和风险防范。比如习近平在今年夏天发表的一次讲话中说有一些干部跟不上新的发展要求，有人说发展就是上项目、搞投资、扩规模。曾经美国财政部的一位官员就表示，习近平在多个关键时刻都强调地方官员要严防金融风险，不能追求短期目标。而现在这些地方官员即使被告知要支持经济增长，他们可能也会认为像过去那样大幅度的上马基建项目再扩大借债可能并不安全，而是采取适度的刺激措施，认为这才与北京现在的步调一致。因此综合这一些信息，更多的经济学家现在似乎得出了这样的结论，中国即使帮助企业，也会非常有针对性的帮助，即使是采取一些措施来提振消费者的情绪，也会采取有限的措施，而不是采取全面的刺激计划。当然，如果中国的情况再进一步出现恶化，甚至出现了明显的政治风险，所有这一切也可能推翻重来。比如去年我们在讲到中国对于疫情的封锁的时候，其实当时基本所有人都已经死心了，认为中国可能只能等到全世界疫情过去之后才会放开，因为中央政府似乎已经笃定这是对于中国保障人民生命安全最安全最稳妥的做法。结果出现了各种各样的抗议，这些年轻人喊出了自己的诉求，一夜之间就取消了疫情的封锁。 一旦现在的经济困境真的是成为了某一种政治上的不稳定因素，这一切也有可能会改变。说到这一点我也要问一下和平先生，中国经济现在出现的问题，的确我们现在在海外可以说是隔岸观火，但是很多在中国现在就在中国做生意的这样的一些企业家，还有中国的一些刚刚毕业的在校学生，他们确实是感到了这一种痛苦。如果中国的经济形势不能够在短期内出现改善的迹象，信息不能够尽快恢复，这是不是有可能演变成为某一种对于习近平的政治压力，甚至是像疫情封锁3年之后出现的这一种走上街头的诉求？
我觉得民众走上街头是一个正常的一个表达情绪、表达痛苦、表达愤怒、表达要求的一个正当的行为。如果有这样的行为出现，而不是天天在网上喊躺平，或者说怎么样，还是好很多。情况有没有达到这样的程度，我们可以看。就算是有这些抗议示威出来，对现在的中共政权和对习近平来讲，增加了民间对他的怨恨，但是不会增加了政权的基本的威胁。原因很简单，在昨天的思想先驱报我们已经讨论了。全球化的民主转型过程中间的痛苦，使很多的国家转型成为开放和民主的社会之后，它的 GDP 反而是下降了，它的国家的动乱的情况反而增加了。如果我们回到1988年，我们认为政治体制改革比经济体制改革重要，经济发展不起来的根本原因是政治体制。那么经过了30-40年之后，那我相信很多的人有了更成熟的一种想法。今天的中国的变革把共产党干掉，那可能是符合大家的痛快的心理，把习近平请下台也是很多人所路径的事情。但是你的力量在哪个地方尤其是多少的民众真正是意识是支持你这种态度。所以我觉得呢，有可能如果经济继续恶化下去如果还有某一些领域某一些年轻人真的是走投无路，他们重新上街的可能性是存在的。但是这种情况和中文纪时候的情况还是有很大的不同，国家的杠杆，国家的力量更强。何况是某一些调整是一种意味的一种可能性，比如说房价的下降。这个如果你是生活在这个纽约，或者是生活在香港，或者是台北，或者是尤其你生活在首尔，你就会知道一个房子对于一个城市的居民来讲那种压力有多大我早一段时间看到首尔的这个情况，好像已经达到70%了。收入的70%了。那么这种压力，如果你反而说中国房子下降，对于中国来讲是一个灾难，实际上你站在首尔的角度来讲，它可能是另外一个角度看这个问题。那么对于年轻人的生活压力，对于新生的这个家庭，它可能意味就产生了这样一个开支的一个压力的释放。对于那些过去把资金或者是把希望寄托在去年我的房子涨了30%，明年我应该至少要涨个10%，结果不但没有涨，把去年还亏回来。其实你看看美国的房地产，它基本上每10年就发一次神经，它就会大跌一次，对吧？如果你挡不住，那你当然亏了；如果你挡住了，你基本上可以发现过几年以后它又回来了。然后我在美国30年就看了房子的各种各样的风波，最严重的就是结构性出现的次贷危机那一次，真的是很多人就上街了，住帐篷了，很多人甚至把房子已经付了5万、10万，甚至20万，甚至30万、40万的房子就抛掉了。为什么？因为那是有一个巨大的经济的杠杆。如果今天的中国的房地产只是房地产商的问题，只是流动资金的问题，或者只是你的预期的问题，而不是呢整个的经济像美国这样出现了一个结构性的一种黑洞，我觉得中国的情况比大家可能感受的要好很多那么就通过这些实际，你今天看起来可能房子过剩也许再过几年看起来那种过剩也许呢并不是说完全没有用就像昨天我跟李琦不是讨论一个问题，就是说你在20年前吧，10几年以前，几乎每个都在骂中国的高铁。我不知道今天还有多少人在骂高铁，还有多少人在算你这个高铁什么时候才能回本呢？ 对吧？就像昨天啊，就是《华尔街日报》写到啊，这个贵州的。这个机场的建设的问题啊，你就不是问我啊多少个机场啊？原来我还说是20个，结果还只有10几个啊！当然你从照片来看，只有2个人坐的这个按摩椅，看起来，但是你看看未来。中国的这种对交通速度的这个需求会越来越强。美国的高铁、美国的地铁为什么荒废啊？就是因为当你的路途啊更长的时候啊，或者是呢，你发现呢，就像欧洲有些国家，现在我早一段时间也看到英国的文章，他说忘记吧，不要坐高铁，可以坐飞机，为什么？飞机更便宜。更准点啊，更千变啊，所以这个东西啊，你今天这么想啊，可能是一个就是这么回事，好像走不出来，而是明天看又是另外一番天地。我们怎么知道40年以前的中国人有一个房子，那简直是单位的领导对你最好的爱抚了。今天中国的房子主要是过剩。对吧？所以我的意思是说，很多的变化在无形中间，它就在调整和变化。你不可能让人永远把希望寄托在房子的无限制的增长。也许再过几年的房子又会回来，这种可能性也不能排除。但是呢，你过去的这个预期有一点过分的单薄。中国的这些人呐，都是非常聪明的，都是灵活多变的，都是通过一件一件的事情积累了经验，积累了教训。毕竟中国经过了这种市场的冲杀，还只有了这个几十年时间，很长时间都是在中国的意识形态控制之下。所以我没有感觉到中国的经济像西方媒体所描述的这样，也没有像中国的朋友感受的这样。感受的不好的那些人确实是存在相当的多，但是同时感受到很好的人也存在，只是感受到不好的人他没办法去理解，或者是愿意去看待那些正在非常努力拼搏的那些新兴企业的那些人或者没有注意到那些科技的企业的人，他们怎么不但在中国他们做得非常好，他们在欧洲、在美国、在很多的国家，他们呢做得不错我看看中国的基建，我们过去还说中国是烂尾工程，中国是不仅仅是烂尾工程，叫烂楼，就是随便就已经倒塌的工程对吧？但是你看看今天早一段时间，我看了美国智库的报告，全世界的水坝，中国在2020年就占了50%现在的比例有多大？全世界的港口全世界的很多的交通，我看全世界能够找到最好的基金队就是中国的基金队了。你在几十年以前能够想象吗？所以我觉得看中国的问题吧，不是说它不严重，你看有些问题确实很严重，但是它国家比较大层次比较多，国家能量比较大人口也多，而且可以延换到了全球市场，所以很多问题也许在你躺平的时候，它就已经产生了另外一个变化。
好，谢谢何明先生的介绍那不知道您最近有没有去中国的经历？您所看到的中国的经济到底是现在我们所看到了的确情况非常的不景气，还是在这些不景气的里面，您又看到了一些光明之点也欢迎您与我们分享。感谢给我们打赏支持的观众朋友们，感谢麦团，感谢艺人，感谢散医生，谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。明天同一时间，思想先驱报与您再会。
Very weak economic data out of China lately.
Yeah. To put it mildly,
I'm just starting very directly. No, the data has been very weak.
I have a collection of paraphrased headlines here.
Oh.
So we're recording this on August 16th, and we just saw an emergency rate cut from China. They also announced that they would stop publishing the urban youth unemployment rate, which is never a good sign.
When you just announced that a certain data point that people have been tracking for years suddenly will not be published anymore. Yeah,
exactly. And a particularly politically sensitive data point too. Retail sales are coming in extremely weak, so rising less than 3% a year. They used to be in double digits. We have deflation setting in, which is something we spoke about on the episode we did with Richard Koo. Manufacturing is contracting. Exports are falling. The yuan is dropping against the dollar. Bank loans at a 14-year low last month.
You really came prepared, Tracy.
I did. I know it's surprising, but I did actually...
I'm not surprised. I'm just impressed.
I did actually put together the data points because they're so startling. And again, if you compare it with all the excitement from earlier in the year about China reopening, the end of COVID zero, there was this expectation that China was going to end up being a positive catalyst for global growth this year. And instead, we are potentially seeing the exact opposite.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I think one of the theories is that there would be this big inflationary impulse globally from the China reopening, demand for steel, demand for various metals, obviously demand for oil and gasoline. And that hasn't picked, there has been this pretty mild, sort of mediocre reopening. It hasn't had that global shockwaves. If anything, people are talking about exporting deflation or disinflation. And then on top of all of the sort of like economic weakness that you bring up, there's also the sort of like financial market weakness. So there was just a story today about one of the companies that sells some of these wealth management products missing payments. There's obviously, I think it's a Country Garden, the big developer, running into a lot of trouble similar to the weakness we've seen in China Evergrande. So to your point, though, just this sort of slew of negative headlines.
Well, also, I think clearly there is concern that if you get real economic weakness in China, that could lead to something bad for the global economy, just in terms of real business activity. But I think there's also this financial channel that is probably the one that's likely to be the most problematic. So if you think about China as in many ways a giant hoarder of financial assets, the big question now is, what are they going to do with those financial assets? Do they have to, for instance, start selling off some FX reserves in order to support the yuan? Are they maybe going to buy fewer US treasuries? So I think that is definitely one aspect of this that is really worth exploring.
So many interesting elements right now. We have to dive deeper into what is going on right now with the Chinese economy and what types of policy responses we might get or we might not get. I always see, there's like a furious debate always on Twitter. It's like, why doesn't the government just give more money to households? Sort of like the Richard Koo conversation, the sort of, got to boost domestic demand. What's the reluctance to do that? Like all these sort of different questions. So I think we really need to dive into them further.
Let's do it.
Well, I'm very excited because I think we have the perfect guest to discuss this. We're going to be speaking with Songwen Zoe Liu. She is the Maurice Greenberg Fellow for China Studies at the CFR. And she is also the author of a new book, Sovereign Funds: How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambitions. Thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you, Joe and Tracy, for having me. And I'm a big fan of the Odd Lots.
Very, very kind of you to say. Why don't we just start off like super simply? In your view, why hasn't China seen a more robust recovery since the lifting of the COVID restrictions?
Well, I would say that actually I have always been a contrarian.
Oh, good. I like this already.
In November last year, I put out a piece on foreign policy, basically made the argument to say that the zero COVID is the least economic challenging problem that President Xi Jinping was facing that day. And even the party, in this case, it would be the party, even if the party decided to remove zero COVID policy the next day, the economy won't sustain a robust rebound very quickly. And the reason comes from what I characterize as the 4Ds: demand, debt, demographics, and decoupling. At that time, it was decoupling, and now it's de-risking.
This is great. The 4Ds.
The 4Ds. It's like the 4Ds of the apocalypse.
No, that's really, I feel like if you want to like have your thing, that's like a really demand, debt, demographics, and decoupling. I'm writing these down.
So
really good.
This is exactly what I wanted to ask you, because I remember even in 2018, 2019, there were concerns and a lot of discussion about a slowdown in China's economic growth. And then COVID happened and we sort of forgot about a lot of the structural issues that we had been talking about. And then lo and behold, in 2023, it feels like a lot of these structural problems are coming back to haunt the Chinese economy. Can you dive a little bit further into what those issues are?
Yeah, sure. I would argue that a lot of these structural problems, exactly as what you were describing, Tracy, it seemed that during COVID, we were, from both inside China and outside China, we were overwhelmed by the sudden pause of the economy because of the shutdown of factories and all that. And it seems that temporarily the pause of the economy covered up the structural problems that had been embedded into the Chinese economic growth model. And then once the party suddenly exit the zero COVID policy, given the consumption pattern that we have observed here in America or in Europe, people started to realize that, okay, so this is a 1.4 billion market and people are going to spend, and that would be powerful and inflationary. And, but short-term revengeful expenditure would not necessarily overcome the long-term structural problems that have dragged the Chinese economy, even just from GDP terms. If we think about the Chinese economy, there are different ways that you can argue that the Chinese economy has peaked. I mean, I'm not necessarily that category, but if we just measure it from GDP perspective or in terms of export as a percentage of GDP, the Chinese economy already peaked. China surpassed Germany back in 2010 to become the largest trading or the largest exporting economy in the world, and has at its height, export as a percentage of GDP was about 30% and has since then plateaued and decreased. Right now it's about 20-something percent. And if you think about GDP growth, the double-digit growth period already ended. So from that perspective, what we actually observe goes back to the 40s. The problem with demand is not necessarily at, I'm not talking about the ultimate demand. I'm specifically talking about the household consumption component of demand. For a long period of time, yes, we can make the argument to say household consumption as a percentage contributing to the Chinese GDP is about 40%. It has been low and, global average. I'm not even talking about, the OECD level. I'm talking about like global average. It's about 60% of GDP, whereas China is 40%. We can make the argument to say, well, the household consumption has been a drag on the Chinese economy. However, up until 2012, by the end of 2012, actually household consumption's contribution to GDP growth at least has been on an upward trajectory. In other words, the growth of household consumption has been positive. You see Chinese people do discretionary vacations and all that. But that has changed since 2013. And if we just stretch it in between President Xi Jinping's 2 terms, the second term was even worse than the first term.
So let's go further into that. A, why has it gotten worse? And then B, there's all this talk. It's like, why don't they just do household stimulus or some version of that? And people are sort of bemused, maybe is the word. It's like, why isn't the Communist Party more willing to extend support directly to the people in rebalancing things? A, why did it get worse? But why is there this reluctance to do something like what we did in the U.S., just sort of print money and give it to people?
Joe, that's an excellent question. You make me think about the why aspect of it, right? Yeah. So fundamentally, I would argue that there are 2 aspects of why there has been a decrease in household consumption. The first one is obviously you can empirically observe from the data, there has been a decline in household income growth. And household income growth up until President Xi Jinping, before President Xi Jinping came to power, household growth was income growth was significantly faster than after he came to power. And his second term was worse on average than his first term. So that's one aspect in terms of household income growth. And then the second aspect of it would be household balance sheet deterioration. And a lot of this comes down to housing market, property value depreciation because of control on real estate policies and all that. Now, the reason why there has been a reluctance in terms of basically provide stimulus checks to Chinese household is not that Chinese economists have not thought about that option. You actually do see people do that on Chinese social media when they realize that, you know what, my cousins in America, they can just line up or wait in their house and then mail would come in, get, like stimulus check. Some students were even getting stimulus check. And then the problem becomes, well, historically, there has not been this kind of precedent, but no president does not necessarily stop the government from inventing one, right? And the deeper problem, I would argue, is the politics. The politics simply would not necessarily work. Part of that is because empowering, this is probably deeper in the Chinese political philosophy in the sense that, well, it's depending upon which political scientist or political economist you are talking to, some people would say, oh, Chinese system is authoritarian capitalism or fragmented capitalism or fragmented authoritarianism and things like that. But fundamentally, what we observe is that the Chinese economic growth model has been built upon financial repression. And at the center of the financial repression are the Chinese banks. And who controls the bank is essentially the Chinese government led by the Chinese Communist Party. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party has always been at the center of capital allocation. And by empowering the household, or for that matter, the private sector, it basically dilute or potentially remove their relevancy.
Interesting.
This is exactly what I wanted to ask you. And I just did a thread on Twitter that made a similar point. But how much of this is a political economy problem in the sense that both on the business side and the consumption side, we've seen the Communist Party be be controlling in many ways. So, for instance, on private business, we've had the property crackdown, the tech sector crackdown, and that would apparently seem to perhaps make people more reluctant to do their own startups and things like that. And then on the household side, it does feel like you have a reluctance from the party to sort of empower the individual at the risk of losing some of their own power and perhaps the collective power.
I am a political economist, so I would argue.
So the answer is yes.
Yes, you are right, Tracy. And from an intellectual perspective, I do think this is a political economy problem because if you look at the history of the Chinese economic growth since 1949, it's not that the economy has never experienced shocks. Actually, the Chinese system experienced a lot of shocks from even in the 1950s. The Chinese economy experienced the Great Leap Forward. And when the communists took over, they also destroyed a lot of the banking systems in Shanghai and elsewhere established by the imperialists, right? So, and then there was also Cultural Revolution and all that. But then there is also the sudden stop of the Cultural Revolution. In other words, the Chinese political economic system, A, is not short of crisis, or for that matter, man-made crisis. And secondly, the Chinese political economic system was also not unfamiliar with sudden reverse or sudden policy corrections. And what that means for today? That basically means the rapid growth of the Chinese economy has fundamentally been led by the government and the party. And it's just a degree of party-state involvement. Now, if we think about the rise of Deng Xiaoping, he corresponded to the rapid rise of China and all that. But if we remember what actually made China, the starting point of China's rapid growth was not necessarily, yes, it was 1978, the clear signal that China is reform and open up. But then there was Tiananmen, and China was put under sanctions and all that. And then 1992, he made this famous southern tour, he toured Shenzhen and all those places, and he gave a clear signal during his speech when he was touring the southern part of China. And I was just recently revisiting his speech, so I remember this is something that I learned very recently, despite reading his speech so many times. So he cited this one example. This rich person, apparently he was one of the, if not the earliest, he was one of the earliest Chinese entrepreneur to make 100 million yuan. He was the founder of this sunflower seed company called Shaziguazi, or idiot sunflower seed.
Wait, and idiot
sunflower seeds, yes. Or fu sunflower seeds, Shaziguazi. And
what a name.
What a name. So at that time, out of jealousy or other reasons, there were some voices among Chinese people or policymakers to say, this guy becomes so rich, we need to take him down. And in his speech, Deng Xiaoping said, I'm aware of these kind of recommendations, but we cannot do that. He struck it down. And the reason, he also explained why the party cannot do that. He said, if we punished him, that would send a terrible signal. It would make people think that we changed our policy of reform and open up. And there are so many instances that we can do things and make people think we changed our policies. And we cannot do that. So from his perspective, the big risk, as he characterized it, is to make mistakes to make people think that we changed our policy.
Sort of, I don't know, maybe it's a devil's advocate question, or I don't know how I'd characterize it. But, obviously there's this big household debt overhang that you're talking about. It seems from the outside, and it seems from many commenters, like a pretty unhealthy real estate market in terms of the level of speculation, the level of costs, etc. It also seems as though the government would like to sort of find a way to get out of that trap where it's not all about, not everything revolves around the cost of housing or buying a new apartment. Is there an argument to be made that stimulus direct to households today under the current economic structure would just sort of further fuel a real estate bubble or real estate demand, and that until the sort of domestic economy has shifted in some way more such that it's not out of that dynamic, that it doesn't make sense to boost demand for those reasons?
First of all, I would say household demand for properties or for housing in China is on a perpetual decline for two reasons. The first reason is that from empirical data, we can observe that China's urbanization rate has peaked. And secondly, this goes back to one of the 4 Ds.
Oh, the third D here,
yes,
demographics.
Demographics. As of last year, Chinese population growth for the first time declined. And there are some numbers saying that actually now India's population is more than Chinese population.
Wow.
So and it's not just the population decline on its own, is not necessarily causing an immediate shock or negative shock on housing demand, but it's actually the lower family formation rate. And the idea that people for cultural reasons, it's very expensive to get married for fancy, banquet and all that. But, it's also very expensive to raise kids in China, especially in big cities. So those are the two structural reasons why demand for housing is on a perpetual decline in China. Even if the government gives stimulus checks to the Chinese household in the current mix of policy environment, I would not necessarily be confident that the Chinese household are going to be incentivized to spend, or B, think that this is a good time to buy a house. And there are two reasons. The first reason is negative confidence shock, and the second is a deflationary policy environment. And the negative confidence, part of that comes from, people's material feeling that their household balance sheet deteriorated, as being felt by the Chinese people as, well, I can empirically observe the value of my house went lower, and yet I am still paying a lot of mortgage. So you see, well, there is early mortgage payment, which the banks are not happy about it. And then on the other hand, as the Chinese GDP slows down, 3% last year, despite record high export last year. And then on top of that, we see the move out or the redistribution of global supply chains, and international multinationals become less, bullish about the Chinese market than, high-paying jobs. There are less high-paying jobs being created. So Chinese people becomes like, well, wait a moment. I don't think I'm going to make more money. Therefore, they are not going to be incentivized to spend. They are going to be more incentivized to save, not because of good environment, but because of lack of confidence. And the deflationary policy environment is because people are waiting. Well, it seems that as from the beginning of this year, the government has put out so many policies to incentivize people to spend, or for that matter, support the housing market. And there is this popular saying, if you don't buy, if I don't buy, the housing price per square meter next week is going to be cheaper by 200 yuan.
So everyone goes on strike, right, to try to get a lower price. I think this is such a good point because historically, a lot of Chinese growth has been driven by infrastructure investment and housing. And it feels like infrastructure has kind of run its course. China does have a lot of great infrastructure right now. And at the same time, housing, the other sort of twin engine of growth, there are a lot of doubts about it, as you just laid out perfectly. I want to go back to something you said earlier. I've never heard anyone phrase it quite like this, but I think it's absolutely correct. The idea that the Chinese economy is sort of predicated on financial repression, and that introduces inherent limitations in a situation like this. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see that working?
Sure. There are so many people talk about financial repressions, and obviously people, Tracy, you are absolutely right. A lot of infrastructure and housing have been the twine growth engine for the Chinese economy because they drive up aggregate demand and they also drive up global commodity prices.
Right.
And I would say that it's not that China built too much infrastructure or for that matter, too much housing. It's that they overbuilt it to the extent that if population keep growing, or more international companies move into China, or there are more demand for factories because of entrepreneurs and all that, growing supply, growing demand. The whole idea is, this is the Chinese policymakers' mentality. As long as I build it, as long as I provided the infrastructure, they will come, right? But now the problem is, international companies are not coming for a variety of reasons. And a lot of the reasons goes back to my quote about Deng Xiaoping. Reason the Chinese leaders have simply made policy choices and policy decisions create a huge uncertainty and signaled, even if they did not have the intention, but at least from our observation, they created the signal that perhaps the Chinese government or the party changed their policies with regard to reform and open up. So a lot of these boil down to, yes, the party is still very much at the center of capital allocation in this whole idea of financial repression. This whole idea is to use high savings that Chinese people tend to save. And this high savings is being channeled through Chinese banking system. And, the four biggest banks are state-owned. And through lower depositors rate, the banks are able to lend cheaply to support state-owned enterprises or channel credit to sectors that are prioritized by the government. And it's many people, who follows China, especially state-owned enterprises, they are familiar with this idea of the government has these guidelines or government guidelines for prioritized sectors. Every 5 years or so, they would update it.
Right. So we've talked about household demand. We've talked about debt. We've talked about demographics. There was actually a headline just yesterday in Reuters, China's fertility rate drops to a record low 1.09 in 2022.
The one headline I left off my list, Joe. You found it.
You had to save one for me. I appreciate that, which is so obviously still going, in the wrong direction. And I want to talk about the actual topic of your book, but I think maybe there's the fourth D in your 4D framework, the decoupling. And so obviously, I think there's some sort of intuitions okay, US or global multinationals maybe less inclined to invest in China. Obviously, the sort of growing trade tensions that started under Trump and really have continued or maybe even ratcheted higher under Biden. But how do you think of that word decoupling? What does it mean to you? How would you define it?
Honestly, I felt decoupling at the individual. First of all, Joe, I appreciate that you asking me, how I felt about it, because people are very confused about what is decoupling or what
Yeah.
are talking about de-risking. And there is actually no formal definition about what they are. At a personal level, the moment during COVID, the moment that I realized I cannot get on a plane from New York to go back to Shanghai or Beijing, for me, that is a sign of a decoupling. And right now there is, if I am correct, there is still no direct flight between New York and Beijing or Shanghai.
Huh. I didn't realize that.
And the flight, right now, I think there are concrete policies that, concrete initiatives in the aviation industry between U.S. and China to increase the flight, but it's still way below pre-pandemic level. So we can concretely observe less and less people-to-people communication. And from economic sense, obviously, or political economy sense, decoupling obviously means, or for that, right now we're talking about de-risk, is very much a Western term if we view it from China or Chinese policymakers' perspective, because this is a term that they condemn a lot. You see Premier Li Qiang in the summer Davos in Tianjin said, decoupling is a terrible idea, is a false premises and all that. But decoupling really, I understand it from the perspective of supply chain diversification. The idea is really not about getting rid of China simply because China is on every part of your supply chain. How could you possibly get rid of China, right? But it's really about not being overly reliant on your one simple supplier. The whole idea of, Econ 101 used to be economy of scale, but now economy of scale become a risk.
Huh. That's very well put. Economies of scale becoming a risk.
So speaking of scale, why don't we talk about the sovereign wealth funds? Because when you look at the numbers of something like CIC, I mean, they're massive. With China, the numbers are almost always massive. The accumulation of this wealth and the fact that it is held by these public investment entities. What does that mean in times like this? China has, billions, possibly trillions of dollars worth of FX reserves. I can't remember the exact number. I think there's some debate over it now as well. But could they tap some of those assets to provide support in times of economic slowdown?
Tracy, that's an excellent point. In times of economic slowdown, I would say there are opportunities. But in times of economic crisis, they have done that before. And actually, China's sovereign funds initially was not created for geopolitical or geoeconomic aspiration, power projection. It was created out of a crisis. The very first time that the Chinese policymakers used foreign exchange reserves was to recapitalize the Chinese banks in the early 2000s when the major Chinese state-owned banks were crippled by non-performing loans. At that time, some of those banks were suffering from non-performing loans as higher than 20 or 25%. So by definition, they were non-solvent. So at that time, they decided that they created this special policy vehicle called Central Huijin and use foreign exchange reserves through Central Huijin to recapitalize these Chinese banks. They have been quite successful. Therefore, when there were a few, I think it's around 2015, if I remember correctly, there was this Baoshang Yinhang crisis. It's another medium-sized bank crisis in China. And a lot of confusion at that time. People were saying that, the central bank is going to take it over. Actually, it's not the central bank. It was Central Huijin. And now when a lot of these bad loan managers or bad debt managers or the so-called state-owned asset management company, a lot of them are in trouble now. And the idea is, I wouldn't be surprised, Huijin is going to step in and take them on its balance sheet, because this is a well-established channel that Central Huijin knows how to do it and do it successfully.
Stepping back further, I mean, a lot of sovereign wealth funds around the world I associate with real commodity export countries. So obviously the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, one of the biggest, the various Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and they tend to be in large part about sort of currency stabilization, given the inherent volatility of GDP and their export channel. You mentioned, the sort of origin of them and the banking crisis. Broadly speaking, what purpose do they serve for China, like currently, setting aside the current economic weakness?
Sure. And Joe, I appreciate that you mentioned the origin of the sovereign funds, right? Because a lot of these so-called sovereign wealth fund in the entire universe of the sovereign wealth fund, as Tracy mentioned earlier, these funds are massive, and the Chinese funds are actually massive. CIC alone, it managed more than 1.3 trillion asset, which is larger than the size of Mexico's GDP. And I think Mexico is like the world's 17th largest economy or something like that. And China has more than that. So broadly speaking, despite that, yes, originally these funds were, the first time that China did it was to solve a crisis. And then as China's reserve accumulation increased, or at least, Tracy was right, there is a debate with regard to how we should think about the size of China's foreign exchange asset. But if we think about foreign exchange reserves using IMF's narrow definition, China's foreign exchange reserve was at one point peaked at $4 trillion. Right now, it's plateaued around $3 trillion, slightly higher than $3 trillion. Mm-hmm. And as China reserve accumulates faster and more, the debate in terms of how to better manage China's foreign exchange reserves started. And after President Xi Jinping came to power in particular, there has been a shift to strategically use the foreign exchange reserves to serve certain foreign policy agenda or to finance certain government initiatives, such as the creation of the Silk Road Fund to specifically advance or finance the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right. So I remember Brad Setzer recently, just on the debate over the size of FX reserves, Brad Setzer had a great piece of research about the possibility that maybe China has an additional $3 trillion, I think it was, worth of assets that aren't necessarily accounted for in official statistics. The idea being that if it hadn't channeled so much of that money into the Silk Road Fund or Belt and Road and programs like that, this would be an available pool of cash that it could use for other things. What is the political appetite, I guess, to move away from using that money to exert Chinese influence in other parts of the world, buy up commodities, things like that, build ports in Africa, whatever, versus maybe starting to channel some of it more domestically?
No, Tracy, that's an excellent point. Brad and I, we are colleagues, and somehow we have done independent research on similar topics and all that. His research has always been brilliant and solid. His charts are fantastic. And I sometimes would question the color coding aspect of it.
Oh, really?
But his charts are great. My estimation of the size of shadow reserves or whatever, they are the assets, the foreign exchange assets that are not recorded on China's official foreign exchange statistics would be in ballpark in the same proximity to Brad's estimate. And in particular, for a lot of these assets managed by state administration of foreign exchange, it established domestic and international investment corporations. And my assessment of to what extent this would be used to to project power globally, I would say perhaps in the current global geopolitical environment, not so much. And the reason is because this is perhaps another point where China's policymakers tend to think differently in terms of economic or financial management, diversification. it used to be that at least starting from 2007 to 2013, during this period of time, the discussion about diversification of foreign exchange reserves has been diversified away from U.S. treasuries because the yield on U.S. treasuries was so low and the opportunity for us to hold most of our reserves in U.S. treasuries so high. Therefore, we need to diversify in strategic assets overseas, such as critical minerals, oil, gas, or, some startup companies and all that. And certain people even put out agenda in terms of these are the 6 areas that we need to think about in terms of strategic asset. But now diversification becomes a risk, because diversification cannot diversify away systemic risk, right? And for China at this moment, systemic risk becomes being sanctioned by the West.
Right.
This is my assessment. Obviously, I did not get this from Xi Jinping or anybody.
Sure.
But given the West collective sanction against Russia, especially the freeze of Russian reserves, now you realize, well, who has the largest foreign exchange reserve in the world? Well, it's China. And where are most of the reserve invested, or most of the assets invested or owned by sovereign funds? Most of the sovereign funds invest in Europe and America. They are not necessarily politically aligned or geopolitically aligned in times of geoeconomic contingency, such as Taiwan.
I think that's a very reasonable assumption. You actually brought up something that I wanted to ask you about as well, which is China's buying of U.S. treasuries. And there is a sort of perpetual concern that one day China is not going to be there to finance the U.S. deficit, I guess. How realistic is that concern in an era where China is potentially worried about something like sanctions?
To be honest, I'm not surprised that the appetite for China to slow down or buy less U.S. treasuries has already happened. Part of the reason is because the conversation has already started in the 2000s, and the people already realized, well, there is opportunity cost of holding U.S. treasuries. At that time, the opportunity cost was purely in terms of economic, but now the problem becomes perhaps there is also geopolitical risk.
Right. The diversification
aspect of it. And then the other aspect of the debate comes down to, well, perhaps China would not necessarily want to dump U.S. Treasury in large amount too fast either, because ultimately any volatility in U.S. Treasury market, or for that matter, the depreciation of U.S. dollar, is going to inflict a huge pain on the Chinese central bank's balance sheet as well.
So I just have one more question, and this is going to be one of those questions that's totally unfair because it's actually like incredibly open-ended. We could probably do another hour on this, but I'm going to it's got to be like one question. But, the title of your book, How the Communist Party of China, or Sovereign Funds, How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambition. We've been talking a lot about the financing, but what are the global ambitions?
Like this is actually another episode.
I know it's a whole other episode because probably have a whole series of but I do think we should touch on that. How would you summarize the global ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party?
I think the global ambitions have changed and evolved over time. It used to be the case that from Deng Xiaoping onward, up until 2013 or the end of 2012, the global ambition has been growing the economy, raising up the people's life standard, and so that the party can stay in power. And starting from 2013 and onward, we started to see there is an inflation of the party's ambition, from the Belt and Road Initiative to the building of shared human destiny. And a lot of these resonate with the current leader, President Xi Jinping's continued search for great ideas. And this brings me back to Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, in his 1992 tour, he said, it is okay for us to not have new ideas as long as we do not change with our economic reform and open up policy. But right now, the ambition seems to be changing, and it seems to be a moving target with regard to figuring out what exactly we are trying to do.
I need to come up with something like the 4Ds of something. Just like, I feel like a calling card on some big thing is like, it's so good.
Well, I'm glad you asked that last question about the ambitions of China, because I think it hints at the fundamental tension here, which, and Zoe mentioned this, which is for years, the party justified its control by promising economic growth. So you have that social contract. But I think the difficulty now is, what if that control is coming at the expense of economic growth? You know, if we're talking about a lot of these difficulties are in fact a political economy problem, then I think it raises that question and becomes extremely tricky for the party to actually navigate.
I hadn't really thought about that point before, about the sort of, I guess I would say, inherently decentralizing effect of more household demand, right? That at some level, if households have more cash, if they're less financially repressed, et cetera, then at some level, like, there's a limit of the degree of control that political leaders can have about that spending and where it goes and how that money is consumed. I hadn't really I sort of had this conception that, well, maybe for like domestic industrial purposes, you want to like prioritize the interests of certain exporters or certain industries. But just the idea of like an inherently like sort of like decentralizing effect is one that I hadn't thought about at all.
Well, and also it sort of highlights the importance of the public business entities in China. And this is something that I only realized from actually spending time in Beijing, which is, a lot of countries have big government buildings or monuments of some sort. A lot of the biggest buildings in Beijing are the CIC and the other sort of state-owned enterprises. And if you walk around the ring roads of Beijing, you get a real sense of their sort of monumental importance to the economy. There's physical evidence of it, which you can't really appreciate unless you see them. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was the idea of more need for diversification in order to offset the decoupling aspect that Zoe talked about. But again, in times like this, where you need more money to support the domestic economy, but at the same time, you're worried about the external environment and you want to diversify away from the U.S. to sort of offset that, that also seems really difficult to do.